Since the inception of our country, firearms have been an integral part of both our nation's history and our culture. It is quite literally written into the fabric of our Constitution that United States citizens have the right to bear arms. Each year, firearms are used by millions of Americans for hunting, recreation, and self defense. But in recent years, with the prevalence of mass shootings and the rampant rise in gun violence, many begin to question whether or not firearms still have a place in the United States. Currently, there are just over 339 million firearms in our country. Each year, the sale and manufacturing of these firearms contributes $62 billion toward the United States GDP and is responsible for the creation of hundreds of thousands of domestic jobs. Not only is the firearms industry one of the largest, it's a large part of the U.S. economy, but many Americans feel as if firearms are intrinsically linked with American culture. Approximately 41% of Americans report owning a firearm of some type, and each year millions use them for a wide variety of activities ranging from recreation and hunting all the way to defense. Annually, there are around 2.5 million self-defense uses of firearms in the United States each year. But with these perceived positives do come many negatives. In 2019 alone, there were approximately 39,861 firearms-related deaths in America. But not all of these deaths can be attributed to homicides, murders, and mass shootings. In fact, the vast majority, 61%, can be attributed to suicide by firearm. Only 32% of gun-related deaths could be attributed to homicides, with the other 4% being attributed to self-defense and accidental shootings. Now, even though homicides and murders only make up around 32% of all deaths related to firearms, these deaths cannot be ignored, and the arguments surrounding them are valid. Too many Americans have seen family members die at the hand of a gun, and too many people have seen the ugly side of the gun epidemic in America. Many Americans that have seen this side of the U.S. gun culture believe that U.S. gun legislation is not stringent enough and does not do enough to curb gun violence. Now, in understanding the gun laws that many believe are too lacking, it is important to look at the two different types: state and federal laws. State laws only apply on a state level and are subservient to federal laws, which apply to everyone. For example, in California, there's a ban on high-capacity magazines that restrict the magazine size of rifles to no more than 10 rounds. But this obviously only applies to residents of California, whereas a federal law like the National Firearms Act would apply to all United States citizens regardless of state affiliation. Some of the most important United States gun legislation are as follows. The previously mentioned National Firearms Act of 1934, which regulates and taxes certain firearms like short-barreled rifles and fully automatic rifles. The Federal Firearms Act of 1938, which establishes a licensure program of federally recognized firearm sellers that are regulated by the state. The 1968 National Firearms Act revision, which banned the import of certain firearms like fully automatic weapons that are deemed destructive devices, but does not ban the ownership of these devices. Then there's the ever-important 1968 Lautenberg Amendment, which bars people with misdemeanor domestic abuse charges from owning or operating firearms. Then there is the oddly named Firearm Owners Protection Act, which didn't actually protect many firearm owners' rights, but it banned the ownership of fully automatic weapons to the vast majority of the public, except those who have a Class III firearms license, which are few and far in between. Following this, there is the Brady Handgun Violence Protection Act, which is one of the most important pieces of United States firearms legislation currently standing. The Brady Act requires that for every purchase of a firearm, a person must undergo a background check and a 5-day waiting period before owning their firearms. Lastly, there's the Violent Crime Control and Law Enforcement Act, which, from 1994 to 2004, outright banned the sale and ownership of weapons that were deemed to be assault weapons. Lastly, there's DC versus Heller, which is actually a pro-firearms act that protected people's rights to own and keep handguns in their homes regardless of specific state laws. Now, the effectiveness of these laws is one of the key things that we're covering. The question is, do they work? And the answer is yes. Well, sometimes. For example, the Lautenberg Amendment worked exactly as it was supposed to. In fact, it resulted in a 19% decrease in spousal homicide rates after it was implemented. Similarly, the Brady Act worked exactly as it was planned and rapidly decreased homicides after it was implemented. Clearly, in this timeline and line graph, you can see after the Brady Act was enacted, homicides went down significantly. But some legislation goes against this trend. For example, the Firearm Owners Protection Act of 1986, which outright banned the ownership of fully automatic weapon to a select few people, should have decreased firearms deaths. But as you can see, it didn't. In fact, around this time, homicides rapidly increased, and that's a common theme you can see. Theme you can see with many pieces of gun legislation. The more complex and convoluted it is, the less it works as intended. There is one exception to this rule. Common sense gun control, like the Brady Act, almost always results in a decrease in gun-related homicides. As you can clearly see that after the Brady Act was implemented, there's a decrease in gun-related homicides because it stopped criminals from owning the guns and doesn't try to arbitrarily stop law-abiding citizens from owning certain types of firearms. And in that lies the answer to our question. Do guns have a place in America? Of course they do, but only for certain people. Instead of attacking the firearms themselves, which are essentially just tools, we should focus on the people, which are the real issue. By itself, a firearm will never kill anyone. So, it should be the job of legislatures to implement common sense gun control that allows responsible, law-abiding gun owners to do as they please and own the firearms they please, but also to stop criminals and those with mental health issues from getting guns. There's no quick, easy solution to the problem of gun control in our country. But it should be the job of legislatures to impose gun legislation that allows law-abiding citizens to own the firearms they wish, while also preventing those that wish to do us harm from getting the firearms. Thank you. That was rough there in the end. I'll be honest.